Good morning, everyone. We had a few technical difficulties in our presentation the other day, and so we're going to re-record this, and hopefully we'll get all of our bugs ironed out here a little bit. This morning we're going to do a presentation on the Earlville Industrial War Hemp Plant and the other industries that followed. But before we even get started, let's talk about what hemp is and why it was so important that they had to build a mill in the 1940s. First off, hemp is a variety of cannabis, but is not marijuana. Marijuana and hemp are two different varieties of the same species. It was farmed in Illinois clear back in the 1800s, and it wasn't until 1898 when the U.S. acquired the Philippines that the hemp production got changed to that area as opposed to being farmed here. The farmers here couldn't compete with the labor costs, and so they lost all the hemp farming around here. Now, the farmers responded to that by trying to develop machinery that would automate the whole production, harvesting and production of hemp, and actually about 24 patents were held by Illinois farmers for that type of machinery. But their efforts to try to revive it did not happen, and so hemp was no longer a crop in Illinois until about 1941. And we all know what happened then. On December 7th, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, the following day they started their attack on the Philippines and the West Indies in order to have a presence in the war effort in the Southwest Pacific region. The growers of hemp used to produce the hemp for the use of rope, cord, and twine primarily. It's also used in textiles, and we'll talk about today's use of hemp a little bit later on in the program. The hemp was of particular value to the Navy because hemp in itself does not break down, the fibers don't break down with the salt water, and that's the reason that it was so necessary during World War II. The War Hemp Program then was established to meet the demand of all these products by the U.S. Armed Forces. The War Hemp Program was assigned to the Department of Agriculture, but the actual teaching of how to grow the crop was under the direction of the Commodity Credit Corporation. So in in the Midwest, there were 42 mills built, and of that, 11 were in Illinois. You can see here the locations other than Earlville were Polo, Galesburg, Galva, Kirkland, Ladd, Lexington, Minonk, Muncie, Shabana, and Wyoming. And in some of those areas, you can still see the Quonset hut type building standing and perhaps used for other things. So Earlville's war hemp plant was determined by, Earlville's selection of the war hemp plant was determined by the government in 1942, and they chose someone who was already part of the agricultural division of the government, and his name was Edwin Packard Flickinger, or E.P. Flickinger. So he moved his family from Lanark, Illinois, and reestablished his roots here as they opened the plant. And as you'll see later, E.P. Flickinger stayed here for even after the plant closed. So they purchased land south of town that was owned by Mrs. Nora Garrity, and the construction started in 1942. It was described as out in the middle of nowhere because, of course, there wasn't a hard road there. It was only a dirt road that went past where the mill was located, which, if you're not from Earlville and you're listening to this, it's just south of town on what's now Route 34. Many Army barracks were brought in and used not only in plant operations, but also in preparation of possibly needing prisoners, Japanese prisoners, to come and help with the harvesting. It was estimated that the mills would cost about $350,000 to build, and the farmers then were asked to join the war effort by assigning at least 10 acres of their land to grow hemp. Now, if you know anything about World War II and the effort, everybody's backing of the war effort, you know, people made many, many sacrifices during that time in order to support that. Now, the farmers are being asked to do that, and they are very skeptical. Why? Because first off, you're asking them to grow a new crop that is very, very labor intensive, and at a time when all the men are being shipped off to war. Also, the prices were lower than what they were getting with their corn crops, their corn and bean crops, and so therefore they would take a loss. On top of that, you're asking them to build or to raise a crop that they've never raised before, and perhaps they won't even get the expected yields that they're supposed to. So their inexperience with the crop was very concerning to them. This is a picture of what the war hemp mill looked like shortly after it was opened. You can see that there are Quonset hut type buildings that are part of that. And we'll learn later that after the war was over, since the war used Quonset hut construction so much because it was quick and easy to put up, that many of those buildings then came for sale by the government, and you can still see that type of building construction in some homes and a lot of businesses. This was just a picture of the open house brochure that they gave out to people. It says here that tells who the manager, E.P. Flickinger was the manager, P.J., and I think his last name is pronounced Maher, and Foreman W.B. Buckwalter and R.J. Cox as the mechanic. It showed how you would come in for your tour. You'd come into the office area, which we know is still standing out there. It's actually a residence now. Come through the whole production area, the shed, and then back down through the men's and women's quarters over here. Now, Laverne Carter, who worked there, tells us that there was a cafeteria as well. I don't see that on this diagram, but it was a 24/7 operation. Eventually, 250 of our local farmers signed a contract to grow the hemp, and so the production, or the first growing season, was in June of 1943. As I mentioned, they operated 24 hours a day, and they had two 12-hour shifts. Peak employment was 135 people, and it was primarily made up of women and high school kids. I read an article, you know how they interview kids coming back from summer and what did you do this summer, and a whole number of them said that they worked at the hemp mill. I'll just give you a few of those names. Dolores Gast Kaminke, who tells me that she still has a couple of little lamps that she bought using her money from the hemp mill that year. June Novak, Mitch Khalil, Wayne Farrell, Dorothy Duffy, Jack Childs, Laverne Carter, she told me Peg Carter worked there. There was a number of people that are very familiar names to us. So, as I mentioned before, Earlville was prepared to bring Japanese prisoners in if they were unable to get local labor, but they never did have to do that. There were other of the mills that brought in German prisoners for the labor, but we ended up not having to do that here. These are just a couple of the advertisements that were in the paper asking for help in the mill. And this is about the only picture we have of, very good picture that we have of any of the employees. On the left is E.P. Flickinger, and that would be Keystad. Rosie Hughes, Hanley, Mamie Steele, and Gus Bader. And Laverne mentioned to me that they were mostly in the administrative office. So farming hemp, what does it mean to the farmer? Their seed was going to cost $11 a bushel, and the seed was drilled into the soil. That's how that was planted. The government paid them $30 to $50 a ton, depending on the quality of the crop, and you'll see in a couple of the pictures how tall they got, anywhere from 4 to 10 feet tall. So there's basically about 4 different processes that happened in the farming of hemp. First, the stalks are cut, and it's described that they're cut by something that was similar to a grain binder. Then they were stalks were laid in rows at right angles, and they were dried, and that was the retting process, when the sun toughened the outside fibers so they could be separated in the mill. And then the manual labor came in, and that was the binding of the stalks. People were sent to the field to tie the bundles and shock them in the field before bringing them to the mill for processing. And hackling is what many of the workers did there. Again, the little girl tells us about that job, and so did Dolores Kaminke tell me. She says, I don't remember what it was called, but I know we combed the fibers. And that was called hackling. It's done within the mill where the fibers are combed, tied together to get them ready to be loaded onto the train cars. This was just a little anecdote that after harvesting, the fields all had to be burned. And so there was some unconfirmed report by the bystanders of people feeling just a little bit giddy on those burn days. In Earlville here, we proved to have very fertile soil, and the average returns were $110 to $115 per acre. It was mentioned in the Earlville Leader that Maynard Martin had the highest yield, 4.4 ton per the acre, with a net return of $200 per acre. I wish I'd been able to find the names of all the farmers who participated in the program. Again, this gives you an idea. To the right is the actual cutting of the stalks, and then on the left-hand side here is E.P. Flickinger with his daughter Marjorie. And this is how they were shocked before they were brought into the mill. This was an example of the special tax stamp that all the farmers had to get, because hemp was not legal to farm in the 40s. So all of the hemp farmers had to get a special tax stamp. And I think this is kind of interesting because it says producer of marijuana. Remember how in the very beginning we talked about how marijuana and hemp were not the same thing? Evidently to the government they were back then. This was Gib Malloy's. So what happens then when the war comes to a close is that we no longer need, the Philippines were freed again, and so they could go back to raising the hemp. So on the day of victory, the mills shut down temporarily so that the employees could get in their cars and trucks and parade through town. There was a total of 143 carloads of fiber that was shipped from Earlville to Belgium and other places, usually by the U.S. Navy or Army. And Earlville produced more fiber than any other mill and was one of only 17 mills that produced 2 crops of hemp before closing. Now, just another little anecdote about that, there was, Anna had a conversation with someone who had told her that in the end, that although we had although we had a very successful crop here, that sometimes the quality wasn't what it was from over in the Philippines, and much of it was not useful in the end. And someone brought up at our meeting that perhaps it was the difference in the soil, because Philippines has very volcanic soil, and obviously we have nice rich black dirt. So now the mills are no longer needed, and so there was all sorts of discussion on what they could do with that. Maybe they could start doing hemp again. Maybe they could start raising that again here, but that never came to fruition. So they started looking for other buyers for the mill itself. Earlville's plant was closed in March of 1946. Now remember, there were 11 of those in Illinois and 42 or 46, I can't remember, in the Midwest. So now we have, for a 2 to 3 year period, we have a huge industrial building with machinery that was shut down. Mr. Flickinger was asked to remain in town and open an ag implement business, and he did, as well as sold cars. So he and his family stayed here for virtually the rest of their lives. So in 1946, a company called Union Asbestos and Rubber Company bought the property and the buildings. And of course, this was back when we didn't know a lot about asbestos, correct? one of the country, this Union Asbestos and Rubber Company was one of the country's leading manufacturers of industrial insulations, packing gaskets, and asbestos textiles. They paid $64,510 for the building and the property, and already had plants in Cicero and Blue Island, so this was their third plant. And so why was this so important? What was happening at the end of the war? Well, all of a sudden you're going to have all these soldiers coming home and needing employment. And so this was written by the mayor at the time in the Earlville Leader. It said, the arrival of such a plant in this city is another definite step into a wider, larger future than Earlville has ever faced before, at a time when returning servicemen are looking for the opportunity at home. So this was much needed, and again, they projected to employ 30 to 50 people in that plant, but actually eventually had up to 75 employees. So it was, that was very welcome. But as what happens with a lot of factories and companies that can see how to make things more efficient, in 1954 the company acquired land in Bloomington and then decided to merge the Earlville and the Cicero plants to that location. So in 1954 it was closed. This is a picture of some of the workers that were there. This was taken in 1949. I'll read you the names from left to right. Lefty Grennan, Shirley Smith, Leroy Hunter, Diane and Ray Neely, Stella Rasmussen, Harold Buckwalter, and then someone that's not been identified, Charles Mitchell, Clint Madden, and Mitch Khalil. And then on the bottom, seated, Rita Edwards, someone else that isn't identified, Dorothy Duffy, Clara Mitchell, and Lena Smith. So once they sold, the plant remained empty for a few months, and then George Gavora purchased the plant to move his Chicago honeybee potato chip factory to a larger space. There's some pretty interesting backstory to George Gavora. So let's think back, this is in the 1950s, but let's go back to like the 1920s. He and his very good friend, Leonard Japp, formed a company together, and they produced snack foods, salty nuts and snack foods for speakeasies in the Chicago area. And many of those speakeasies were owned by who? Al Capone. And so there's a lot of urban legend to Al Capone stories, but I have read this in a couple different places. And anyway, so they had a very, very successful business. He made sure they always had work, and they did very well until what happened, the Depression in 1929. Everybody lost everything then, and so that company, the partnership then dissolved. This is a picture, though, of the van that they had, and there's a little story about each of them putting in $5 a piece to buy this van, and $27 worth of product, and that's how they started out. But I thought it was pretty cool. It says on here, you can't see it very well, it says honeybee potato chips. So that was George Gavora's baby there, and but again, the rest of them were, the two of them did very, very well. So fast forward just a little bit, now back into the 30s, they are no longer partners, but I just want to tell you a little bit about this Leonard Japp, who doesn't really have a lot to do with Earlville now, but it does have to do with a kind of an interesting story. So he formed partnership with another guy, and they again had a food company and did very well. And what happened? And they were called it was called Mrs. Japp's Potato Chips. And in the 1940s, then what happened was it was the middle of the war, and the vendors of the Mrs. Japp's Potato Chips took exception to the title Mrs. Japp's. So they Mr. Japp ended up having to change the name of his company I can't think what the first choice was, but first choice had already been taken, so he ended up going with Jay's potato chips, and the rest of that is history. So Maize Industries then, in the 1940s, Mr. Gavora again decided to start manufacturing corn products like popcorn, caramel corn, cheese-covered pops in Chicago. He purchased the buildings and the property in 1955, again to locate to a larger area compared to this plant that he was in Chicago. So some of his brand names were Core Cheese, Core Crumbs, Core Nicks, Core Caramel, and the company was projected to employ 12 to 14 women when they opened, along with men who would operate the machinery. Well, he overshot a little bit because, as it turned out, Anna was talking with Bob Gavora, George's son, and said that he really only ended up with 5 to 6 to 7 people that actually worked there. Mrs. Gavora ran the packaging machine. But you can see here in the roof that said of the old hemp mill, it now says Maize Industries. This is a picture of one of their ads here. These are caramelettes being sold at Helen's Food Mart, R&H Supermarket, and the Earlville Supermarket. And then the packaging over here, the plastic packaging for all the corn. In 1956, shortly after he bought the facility, he did lease out one of the buildings to a Thunderbird Redwood Manufacturing Company from Carthage, Texas. And that's exactly what they did, was that they manufactured redwood wood to be used in building. Mr. Gavora's business continued to grow. He was constantly thinking of new innovations, and actually added on almost 7,000 square foot of floor space in 1959. In 1964, they were being so successful that he started retail routes for sale and distribution. So they bought vans to go around and distribute to other vendors. A couple things about George Gavora. He also had an antique shop on Railroad Street, right next door to the pool hall. And he had a sign on his door that said, "Open 1 to 3. If I'm not here, I'm probably playing cards at Marv's next door." He was a very community-minded guy, and always in support of anything that was happening in the community. And he was good at giving back. This is an ad from 1958 when he started to provide transportation and tickets to the Shrine Circus for all the 4th graders. Eventually became 5th graders, and actually there was one class, mine, in 1963 that got to go by train. I think we were the only ones that got to go by train. The rest of them were by buses. And I believe that he did that through 1964. So Mr. Gavora decided in 1965 that he planned to liquidate his business due to ill health. And so the property sat empty until 1968 when Jewel Foliage Company leased and purchased the building and the land from Gavora. And it's kind of interesting because when we did this presentation the other day among the crowd that was here, no one knew about this Jewel Foliage that was there. Larry Molly mentioned that he does remember that they went in and did like foam spraying on the walls, probably to make more of a greenhouse effect. But they were a distribution and headquarters for the processing of floral greenery in the entire West Coast. So that was all sitting out there happening, and not a lot of people knew it. Roland Magruder was the manager, and it closed after 4 years, but it was here 4 years, you know, that's not nothing. It eventually was sold to Roman Development Company of San Antonio, Texas in 1972. And I can't for the life of me tell you what that development company did. I can't find any information about it. I don't know if it just purchased it for investment, for a tax write-off or what. But the next thing that was documented about that was in 1975, Roman Development sold the property to the Aluminum Foundry Corporation. And it kind of sounded by the ads leading up to that that was going to be a fairly decent employer for Earlville. However, 1 week after it opened, almost the entire mill burnt down. So that never opened, and I don't know when I can't find any documentation about them selling it. And then we kind of opened it up to the crowd just to ask whether or not you knew of any other business or anything that happened out in those buildings, the ones that were left, or maybe some of the newer buildings that were put up. One of the things is that Dr. DeTore used to store his Frazier classic cars out in that area. Buckinger's was a glass wholesaler, and he was in business there for about 10 years. And understand that seed corn was stored out there at one time or another. And other than that, we really can't figure out much of anything else that was that took place in those buildings. So that is our presentation for the day. That tells you a little bit about what happened from the beginning to the end of the hemp mill through the burning down of the buildings. And I think there's primarily a residential area back there now. We thank you very much for tuning in, and I hope you have a good day.